Commander Thalvex stood on the bridge of his warship and stared at the blue planet spinning slowly in the darkness of space. And he felt nothing but contempt for the primitive world below him. The Valdorian Empire had conquered 200 star systems across the galaxy, and their method was always the same, always perfect. And it had never once failed them in 10,000 years of expansion. First, they would study a civilization from orbit, watching their transmissions, learning their languages, and mapping their military forces with careful precision. Then they would identify the warrior caste, because every species had one. Whether they called them soldiers or knights or guardians or protectors. Finally, they would strike at the warrior caste with overwhelming force, destroying their training facilities and killing their leaders and scattering their armies like dust in the wind. Once the warriors fell, the rest of the population always surrendered, because civilians were the same everywhere in the galaxy. They were soft and weak and afraid, and they existed only to serve those who were strong enough to rule them. Thalvex had conquered 17 worlds using this doctrine, and he expected Earth to be his 18th and easiest victory. His intelligence officer, a young female named Yelanara, approached him with a data tablet in her hands and confusion written across her face. "Commander, I have completed my analysis of the human civilization, but the results do not make sense to me," she said. Thalvex took the tablet and scrolled through the information, and his confusion grew with every page he read. The humans had military forces, yes, but they were small and scattered across hundreds of different nations that seemed to constantly argue with each other. They had something called veterans, individuals who had served in their armed forces. But these veterans did not remain in military compounds or training facilities. Instead, they lived among the regular population, working ordinary jobs that had nothing to do with warfare. One veteran drove a truck that delivered packages to homes, and another worked in a building where young humans learned to read and write. A third veteran spent his days growing food in fields of dirt, and a fourth sat in a small room and helped other humans with their emotional problems. "This is madness," Thalvex said as he handed the tablet back to Yelanara. "No species would scatter their warriors like this, because it makes them impossible to coordinate and easy to defeat. Perhaps they are hiding them," Yelanara suggested quietly. "Perhaps they know we are watching, and they have concealed their true warriors among the common population." Thalvex laughed at this idea, because it was the most inefficient military strategy he had ever heard. If that were true, then these veterans would be useless in a real conflict, he said. A warrior must train constantly to maintain his skills, and a warrior who spends his time driving trucks or teaching children is no warrior at all. He made his decision quickly, because he was confident and experienced, and he had never lost a battle in his entire career. "We will deploy a standard subjugation force to the largest landmass," he commanded. 50,000 soldiers should be more than enough to establish a beachhead and demonstrate our power. The invasion force landed in a region the humans called Texas, and at first everything went exactly as Thalvex had predicted. The human military responded slowly and in small numbers, and the Valdorian soldiers swept them aside with ease by the end of the first day. The Empire controlled a territory the size of a small moon, and Thalvex began planning the next phase of his conquest. But then strange things started to happen. A patrol of 12 Valdorian soldiers went into a wooded area to search for human resistance fighters, and they never came back. Their communication devices went silent without any distress calls, and when a search party went to find them, they discovered only empty forest and scattered equipment. Another patrol vanished near a human settlement, and then another disappeared while guarding a supply depot by the end of the first week. The Valdorian forces had lost nearly 300 soldiers, and they had not seen a single enemy combatant. Thalvex demanded answers from his officers, but none of them could explain what was happening. The human military was still retreating and regrouping far to the north. So these attacks were not coming from organized forces. Someone else was killing his soldiers. Someone who moved like shadows and struck without warning and left no survivors to tell what had happened. A scout reported finding strange symbols carved into trees near the sites where patrols had vanished. The symbols showed a coiled serpent ready to strike, and beneath them were words in the human language that translated roughly to "Do not step on me." Thalvex did not understand the meaning of this message, but something about it made him feel uneasy for the first time since arriving at Earth. Then his forces captured their first human prisoner, and everything Thalvex thought he knew about warfare began to crumble. The prisoner was an old male with gray hair and wrinkled skin, and he had been found on a small farm tending to large four-legged animals that the humans called cattle. He wore no uniform and carried no weapons, and the soldiers who captured him laughed at how weak and fragile he appeared. They brought him to Thalvex for interrogation, expecting the old human to tremble and beg for mercy, like all civilians did when faced with the might of the Empire. But the old man did not tremble, and he did not beg. He sat in his restraints with perfect calm. And when Thalvex demanded to know where the resistance fighters were hiding, the human simply smiled. "Son, I spent 3 tours in a place called Fallujah," the old man said in a voice that was quiet but completely unafraid. "I have seen things that would turn your purple skin white with fear, and I have done things that still wake me up at night after 40 years. He leaned forward as much as his restraints would allow, and his eyes were hard and cold like stones at the bottom of a frozen river. "You think you scare me?" he asked. "You think your little invasion impresses me?" Thalvex felt something he had never felt before when facing a prisoner, and it took him a moment to recognize the emotion as uncertainty. "You are old and weak," he said, trying to regain his confidence. "You are a farmer, not a warrior." The old man laughed, and there was no fear in that sound, only a dark amusement that made Thalvex want to step backward. "I was a warrior before you were born, and I will be a warrior until the day I die," the human said. "The uniform comes off, but what is inside never goes away." He looked around the interrogation room at the Voldorian soldiers standing guard, and he smiled again with those cold eyes. "You made a mistake coming here," he said. "You looked at Earth and saw civilians, but that is not what we are." "Then what are you?" Thalvex demanded. The old man answered with a single word that Thalvex would remember for the rest of his life. A word that would haunt his dreams and change everything he thought he knew about conquest. "Veterans," the human said. "We are all veterans of something, and we have been waiting our whole lives for someone to give us a reason to remember what we are." That night, another patrol vanished into the darkness, and Thalvex began to understand that he had not invaded a planet of civilians at all. He had awakened something ancient and terrible, a species that did not separate its warriors from its people, because every single one of them carried war in their hearts. And now they were hunting his soldiers through the shadows, patient and silent and utterly without mercy, like predators who had finally found worthy prey. Ambassador Yelanara had requested a transfer from Commander Thalvex's invasion force because she wanted to understand the humans better, and the Empire had assigned her to study the occupation forces in a cold northern region called Finland. She had read the reports from Texas with growing concern, and she knew that something was very wrong with the Empire's understanding of human civilization. The humans were not behaving like any conquered species she had ever studied, and the resistance was growing stronger instead of weaker with each passing day. Her assignment in Finland was supposed to be simple. She would observe the occupation forces, interview human prisoners, and compile a report that would help the Empire develop better tactics for controlling the population. But what she witnessed in Finland would change her understanding of warfare forever. The incident happened on a cold morning when the fog mean when the barfare forever. The incident happened on a cold morning when the candid ground was covered with white frozen water that the humans called snow. A Valdorian checkpoint had been established on a road leading into a small human settlement, and Yelenara was observing the soldiers as they searched vehicles and questioned travelers. An elderly human female approached the checkpoint on foot, moving slowly through the snow with small, careful steps. She was very old, perhaps 70 or 80 years by human counting, and she carried a basket covered with a cloth that smelled of sweet baked food. The soldiers scanned her with their detection equipment and found no weapons, no communication devices, and no dangerous materials of any kind. She was just an old grandmother bringing baked goods to her family. And the soldiers laughed at how harmless she appeared. One of them took a piece of her food and ate it while the others made jokes about the weakness of human elderly. They let her pass without any further inspection, because she was clearly no threat to anyone. Yelenara watched the old woman walk away toward the settlement, and something about the way she moved caught the ambassador's attention. There was a precision in her steps that did not match her apparent frailty, a controlled economy of movement that seemed wrong for someone so old and weak. But Yelenara dismissed her concerns and returned to her observation post, and she thought nothing more about the grandmother until later that night. The attack came in the darkest hours before dawn, when the soldiers in the nearby barracks were sleeping deeply after a long day of patrol duties. Yelenara was awakened by the sound of alarms, and she rushed to the barracks to find a scene of absolute horror. 12 Valdorian soldiers lay dead in their beds, killed silently and efficiently, without any of them having time to call for help or reach for their weapons. Their throats had been cut with surgical precision, and the killer had moved through the barracks like a ghost, taking life after life without making a sound. The surveillance footage showed only one figure moving through the shadows, a small elderly human female carrying a kitchen knife that was now stained dark with purple Valdorian blood. It was the grandmother from the checkpoint, and she had killed a dozen trained soldiers with nothing but a blade designed for cutting vegetables. Yelenara felt her blood run cold as she watched the footage again and again, trying to understand how this was possible. The old woman moved like liquid darkness, flowing from one target to the next with movements that were practiced and perfected over decades of experience. She knew exactly where to strike, exactly how to silence her victims before they could scream, and exactly how to disappear into the night before anyone discovered what she had done. Yelenara immediately requested the humans' records from the Empire's intelligence database, and what she found made her want to abandon the occupation entirely. The grandmother was 78 years old, and she had been born during a terrible human conflict called the Second World War when she was only 9 years old. Enemy soldiers had occupied her country, and she had joined a resistance movement that the humans called partisans. She had killed her first enemy soldier at age 9. Using a knife she had stolen from her mother's kitchen over the next 6 years. She had participated in dozens of operations against the occupation forces, killing soldiers, destroying supplies, and gathering intelligence for the resistance. When the war ended, she had returned to normal life. She had married, raised children, become a grandmother, and spent her days baking bread and tending her garden. But she had never forgotten what she learned during those terrible years, and she had never lost the skills that had kept her alive when death surrounded her every day. The Empire had looked at her and seen a harmless old woman, but she had been a killer since before most Valdorian soldiers were born. Yelenara began researching other humans, and what she discovered filled her with a deep and growing dread. There was a shopkeeper in a region called Ukraine, whose family had survived something called the Holodomor, a great famine that had killed millions of humans. His grandmother had taught him how to hide food, how to move without being seen, and how to kill anyone who tried to take what was his. There was an accountant in a nation called Japan whose grandfather had fought in a terrible battle at a place named Iwo Jima. The old man had passed down stories of sacrifice and determination, and the accountant had grown up believing that death was preferable to surrender. There was a nurse in a country called Vietnam who still remembered the sound of military helicopters from her childhood. She had learned to hide, to survive, and to fight back against invaders who thought they could not be defeated. Every human family seemed to carry memories of war, passed down from generation to generation like a sacred inheritance. They told stories of survival and resistance around their dinner tables, teaching their children and grandchildren that ordinary people could become warriors when their homes were threatened. The humans did not have a warrior caste because they did not need one. Every generation produced new soldiers, forged in the fires of conflicts that the Empire had never even heard of. Every family contained veterans who had learned to kill, and had passed that knowledge to their descendants. Every human carried the potential for violence inside them. Sleeping quietly until something awakened it, Yelanara composed an urgent transmission to High Command, and her hands trembled as she wrote the words that she knew would change everything. Request immediate intelligence brief. She wrote, "Human warriors do not retire from combat. They simply wait for the next war to begin." She explained what she had learned about the grandmother, about the partisans, about the generations of warfare that had shaped every human on the planet. She described how humans passed war through their bloodlines like a genetic inheritance, how every family contained soldiers, how every generation added new skills and new reasons to fight. The Empire has not invaded a civilization of civilians, she concluded. We have invaded an entire species of sleeping warriors, and we have made the terrible mistake of waking them up. High Command received her transmission and immediately classified it at the highest level, because the implications were too frightening to share with ordinary soldiers, if Yelanara was right. Then the Empire's entire doctrine of conquest was useless against the humans. You could not defeat a warrior caste when every single member of the species was a potential warrior. You could not break a civilization's will to fight when that will was encoded in their very culture, passed down from parent to child for thousands of generations. You could not win against an enemy who looked like harmless civilians but carried the souls of soldiers inside them. The grandmother was captured 3 days later, and she died without revealing any information about the resistance. Her last words, spoken to the Voldorian interrogator who had failed to break her, were simple and chilling. "You cannot defeat us," she said with a smile on her wrinkled face, "because we have been fighting since before your empire existed, and we will still be fighting long after it is gone." Yelanara watched the recording of the old woman's final moments, and she understood that the Empire had made a terrible and perhaps fatal mistake. They had come to Earth, expecting to find civilians who would kneel before superior force. Instead, they had found a planet full of grandmothers who could kill 12 soldiers with a kitchen knife. And that was only the beginning of what the humans could do. General Krathox arrived on Earth with a reputation that made lesser commanders tremble with respect. He was the conqueror of the militant worlds, the destroyer of the hive queens of Nexer 7, and the greatest strategist the Voldorian Empire had produced in 500 years. When High Command learned that the invasion of Earth was stalling, they immediately dispatched Krathox to salvage the campaign and restore the Empire's honor. He reviewed the casualty reports during his journey through space, and for the first time in his long and glorious career, he felt something close to genuine unease. The numbers made no sense according to everything he knew about warfare. The Empire had lost nearly 2,000 soldiers in the first month of occupation, but they had not fought a single major battle against an organized enemy force. The human military was still retreating and regrouping, And yet Valdorian soldiers were dying every day in ambushes, assassinations, and mysterious disappearances. Krathox landed at the main command base and immediately began interviewing officers about what they had witnessed. The stories they told him were unlike anything he had ever heard from a conquered world. A human mechanic had been captured near a disabled Valdorian armored column. An interrogation revealed that he had sabotaged the vehicles using modified farming equipment. He had no military training whatsoever. He had simply understood machines well enough to know exactly how to break them. A human librarian, an elderly female who spent her days organizing books in a small building, had been discovered coordinating resistance cells across an entire region. She used something called ham radio, a primitive communication technology that the Empire had not thought to monitor, and she had helped hundreds of attacks without ever leaving her library. Most disturbing of all was the report about a human child who had led a Valdorian patrol into a deadly ambush. The child was only 12 years old, and when soldiers asked her for directions to a resistance hideout, she had smiled sweetly and offered to show them a shortcut through the forest. She led them directly into a kill zone where hidden fighters destroyed the entire patrol. And when asked why she had done this, she simply said that her father had taught her those woods. Since she could walk, Krathox realized that he was facing an enemy unlike any he had ever encountered. The humans were not fighting like soldiers who followed orders and maintained discipline and wore uniforms that identified them as combatants. They were fighting like survivors, like animals defending their territory, like something far more dangerous than any warrior caste he had ever destroyed. He decided to demonstrate the Empire's absolute power by making an example of a small human settlement that intelligence believed was supporting the resistance. The town was called Millbrook, and it contained approximately 3,000 civilians. According to Valdorian scans, Krathox ordered his forces to surround the town and demand complete surrender, promising destruction if the humans did not comply. The response came not from the town's leaders, but from the townspeople themselves. They emerged from their homes carrying weapons of every imaginable type. Military rifles that had been hidden in basements, hunting shotguns that had been passed down for generations, and improvised explosives built from farming chemicals. But it was not just the obvious fighters who attacked. A middle-aged female who had been a kindergarten teacher before the invasion led a group of civilians in a flanking maneuver that caught the Valdorian forces completely by surprise. She moved with confidence and precision, issuing orders that her followers obeyed without question. And she personally killed 6 soldiers before being captured. Krathox interrogated her himself, because he needed to understand how a teacher could fight like a trained commander. "Why do you fight?" he demanded as she sat before him, bloodied but unbroken. "You have no military training, and you cannot possibly hope to defeat us." The human laughed, and there was genuine amusement in the sound, despite her injuries and her certain death. "General, I have managed 35-year-old children who were full of sugar and had not taken their naps," she said with a smile that made Krathox uncomfortable. "I have maintained order in rooms full of screaming, irrational little creatures who wanted to kill each other over toys." She leaned forward, and her eyes were hard like polished stone. "You think your soldiers frighten me?" she asked. "I have seen true chaos, General, and your little invasion does not even come close." Krathox stared at her, trying to understand how this soft-looking female could face death with such complete calm. "You are not a soldier," he said. "No," she agreed. "I am something worse. I am a civilian who has decided to fight, and there are millions more like me." She nodded toward the window, where the sounds of battle still echoed through the streets of Millbrook. "We are all soldiers," she said. "We just do not dress like it." And we do not announce ourselves until it is too late for you to prepare. The battle for Millbrook lasted 3 days. And when it was over, the Valdorian forces had won. But their victory felt hollow and terrifying. They had lost 800 soldiers taking a town of 3,000 civilians. The humans had fought with military weapons when they could find them. But they had also fought with kitchen knives and baseball bats and their bare hands. They had used their own infrastructure as a weapon. They had blown up bridges, poisoned water supplies, cut power to Valdorian equipment, and collapsed buildings onto advancing soldiers. They understood their own world in ways the Valdorians never could. And they used that knowledge with deadly creativity. Krathox walked through the ruins of Millbrook and saw bodies everywhere. Both Valdorian and human, the humans had not surrendered even when defeat was certain. They had fought until they could no longer stand. And many had died with weapons still clutched in their hands. He found an old human male who had been killed defending a school building, and the body was surrounded by 6 dead Valdorian soldiers. The old man's records identified him as a retired construction worker who had once served in something called the Army Corps of Engineers 50 years before he had used his knowledge of buildings to create traps and fortifications that had held back an entire company of Imperial soldiers 50 years since his military service. And he had still remembered everything he had learned, still possessed the skills that had made him dangerous. Krathox finally understood what Ambassador Yelinara had been trying to tell High Command. The humans did not separate their military from their civilian population, because the distinction was meaningless to them. Every human was a potential fighter. Every human carried memories of war, and every human had been raised on stories of ancestors who had fought and survived against impossible odds. Their teachers knew tactics. Their farmers knew demolitions. Their elderly remembered wars from before the Empire existed. They were not a civilization. They were an army pretending to be a civilization, waiting patiently for someone to give them a reason to reveal what they truly were. Krathox composed his report to High Command that night, and his words were heavy with the weight of his failure. The human resistance cannot be defeated by conventional means, he wrote, because there is no distinction between their soldiers and their civilians. Every human is a fighter waiting to be awakened. Every generation carries the knowledge of the previous wars. Every home is a potential fortress, and every citizen is a potential assassin. He paused before writing his final conclusion, because he knew that his words would terrify the Emperor himself. I recommend immediate withdrawal from Earth, he wrote. Not because we cannot win, but because victory would cost us more soldiers than this planet is worth. We came here to conquer civilians. Instead, we awakened a planet full of warriors who had simply been waiting for a worthy enemy. His recommendation was rejected by High Command, because the Empire could not admit defeat to a primitive species. But Krathox knew in his heart that the war was already lost. Even if the politicians refused to accept it, the humans had proven that they would fight to the last child, the last grandmother, the last teacher with a rifle in her hands, and the Empire simply did not have enough soldiers to kill them all. High Adjudicator. Molvith received the classified transmission aboard the Imperial throne ship as it orbited a dead world 3 star systems. Away from Earth, he was one of the 5 most powerful individuals in the Valdorian Empire, and his duty was to advise the Emperor on matters of conquest and expansion. The holographic report that materialized before him painted a picture of systematic disaster, and as he read through the intelligence summaries, he felt a cold fear spreading through his ancient body. The invasion of Earth had become a catastrophe beyond anything the Empire had experienced in its 10,000-year history. The humans had begun coordinating their resistance on a global scale, and the speed of their organization defied all logic veterans from 100 different human conflicts. Ancient enemies who had once tried to kill each other were now sharing tactics and resources across primitive communication networks. A human from a nation called Russia was teaching urban warfare techniques to humans from a nation called America. Despite the fact that these two groups had spent decades pointing weapons of mass destruction at each other, a human from a place called Israel was coordinating operations with humans from a place called Palestine, even though their peoples had been fighting over the same land for longer than the empire had. Known about Earth, a human from a country called Japan was working alongside humans from countries called China and Korea, nations that had committed terrible atrocities against each other within living memory. Their ancient hatreds dissolved instantly when faced with a common enemy. And Malvith realized that humanity's endless conflicts had been nothing more than practice for a moment exactly like this. They had been training each other for war since before they discovered fire. And now they were combining everything they had learned. But the true horror was contained in a section of the report that Imperial Intelligence had designated the Sleepers. The humans had organizations called intelligence agencies, groups like the CIA and MI6 and Mossad and FSB. And these organizations trained individuals in skills that made Valdorian assassins look like clumsy amateurs. The agents of these organizations learned how to kill with any object, how to resist interrogation, how to gather information without being detected, and how to survive in hostile environments for years at a time. And then, when their service was complete, these deadly individuals were released back into the civilian population. They became teachers and doctors and business executives and truck drivers, living ordinary lives while carrying extraordinary skills hidden inside them. They are everywhere. The intelligence report stated in words that made Molvith's blood run cold. Any human could be one of them, and we have no way to identify them until they choose to act. The report included footage of an incident that perfectly demonstrated the danger of these sleepers. An imperial governor had been assigned to administer a conquered human city, and he had hired a human female to serve as his translator and assistant. She was soft-spoken and polite, always smiling, always helpful. And she had served the governor faithfully for 3 months without any sign of hostility. She learned the layout of his headquarters, memorized the patrol schedules of his guards, and discovered exactly when he was most vulnerable. Then one night she had killed 17 Valdorian soldiers with her bare hands before they managed to stop her. And the governor was among the dead. Her records revealed that she had once worked for an organization called the Central Intelligence Agency, and she had been trained in assassination and infiltration at a facility that the humans called the Farm. She had retired from that work 15 years before the invasion, and she had been working as an ordinary translator when the Valdorians arrived, but she had never forgotten her training. And she had been waiting patiently for the right moment to use it. Molvith watched the surveillance footage of her attack again and again, trying to understand what he was seeing. She moved through the guards like water flowing through rocks, striking pressure points and vital organs with perfect accuracy. She killed without hesitation, without mercy, and without any emotion showing on her face, except a calm concentration that was more terrifying than rage could ever be. When she finally fell to overwhelming numbers, she was smiling, and her last words were a phrase in an Earth language that translated roughly to give them hell. The adjudicator summoned his advisors for an emergency council, and the discussion lasted through the night. "We cannot fight an enemy we cannot identify," one advisor said. "Any human could be a sleeper agent, and we do not have the resources to monitor every single civilian. The humans have a saying that seems relevant," another advisor added, his voice trembling slightly. "They call it the right to bear arms. And it is not merely a law but a philosophy. What does it mean?" Molvith asked. It means they believe every citizen should be capable of warfare, the advisor explained. They believe that the power to kill should belong to every individual, not just to the state. Mulvith stared at the galactic map displayed on the wall of his chamber, and Earth glowed as a single blue dot among the thousands of worlds the Empire had conquered. That tiny dot now pulsed like a warning beacon, like a signal of danger that the Empire had been too arrogant to recognize. "What have we awakened?" Mulvith whispered, and no one had an answer for him. More reports arrived over the following days, each one worse than the last. Valdorian supply lines were being sabotaged by humans who looked like ordinary workers but possessed knowledge of demolitions. And Poison's occupation headquarters were being bombed by humans who built explosive devices from household chemicals. And farming equipment, military vehicles were being destroyed by humans who understood machinery well enough to make it fail at the worst possible moments and everywhere. In every city and town and village on the planet, the sleepers were awakening. Former soldiers who had been living peaceful lives for decades suddenly remembered their training. Former intelligence agents who had been raising families and attending children's sporting events suddenly revealed their hidden skills. Former resistance fighters from conflicts that the Empire had never heard of suddenly began organizing new cells and new operations. The humans were not just defending their world. They were methodically dismantling the occupation with skills they had accumulated over thousands of years of constant warfare. Mulvith composed his recommendation for the Emperor with great reluctance, because he knew that his words would acknowledge the Empire's first true defeat. The human population cannot be controlled through conventional occupation, he wrote, because we cannot distinguish between civilians and combatants. Their entire species has been forged in the fires of constant war. Their children learn to fight before they learn to read. Their elderly carry skills that our young soldiers cannot match. Their sleepers walk among us undetected, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He paused, remembering the grandmother with the kitchen knife, the teacher who led troops into battle, and the translator who killed 17 soldiers with her hands. "I recommend immediate strategic review of our Earth campaign," he concluded. "The cost of total subjugation may exceed our capacity to pay." The Emperor received his recommendation with fury, because Valdorian emperors did not accept defeat from primitive species. But Mulvith knew the truth that the Emperor refused to accept. The humans were not primitive at all. They were ancient warriors who had been fighting since before the Empire existed. They had simply hidden their nature behind smiling faces and ordinary lives. And the Empire had made the fatal mistake of believing the disguise. Now the masks were coming off, and the warriors underneath were ready to show the galaxy what humanity could really do. Emperor Valdros the Eternal sat upon his crystalline throne and watched the human delegation enter his audience chamber with an expression of barely concealed rage. He was the supreme ruler of 200 star systems, the commander of the largest military force in the galaxy, and he had never in his long life been forced to negotiate with a species that his empire had invaded. Yet here he was, surrounded by his most elite guards, preparing to discuss terms with 3 humans who walked through his palace as if they owned it. Ambassador Yelenara stood to the side of the throne, and she studied the human negotiators with a mixture of fear and fascination. The first was an elderly male with silver hair and a straight posture that spoke of decades of military discipline. His records identified him as a former leader of something called the United States Marine Corps, and he had commanded troops in 3 major human conflicts before retiring to teach young humans about history. The second was a young female, small and unassuming, with dark hair and quiet eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. Imperial intelligence had flagged her as a former operative of an organization called the Mossad, and her file contained more redacted sections than readable text. The third was a large male with weathered skin and calloused hands who had listed his occupation simply as farmer. But his record showed that he had once been something called a Green Beret, an elite human warrior who specialized in training resistance forces on occupied worlds. All three of them moved with a casual confidence that made the Imperial Guards grip their weapons more tightly. These humans were not afraid to be standing in the heart of enemy power, surrounded by soldiers who could kill them in an instant. They had walked willingly into the throne room of their conqueror, and they acted as if they were the ones in control. "Your terms?" the Emperor demanded, his voice echoing through the crystal chamber. The Marine stepped forward, and his voice was calm and clear, like a man who had delivered ultimatums before and knew exactly how to do it. "You will withdraw all forces from the Sol system within 30 standard days," he said. "You will return all human prisoners to their home nations without conditions." He paused, and his eyes met the Emperor's with no trace of submission or fear. "And you will broadcast to every system in your empire exactly what happened here," he continued. "You will tell them that you came to Earth expecting to conquer civilians, and you will tell them what you found instead." The Emperor's face twisted with fury at the insolence of this demand. "And if I refuse?" he asked, his voice dangerous and low. The farmer stepped forward, and when he smiled, it was the most terrifying expression Yelanara had ever seen on a human face. "Your Majesty, we have been at war with each other for 10,000 years, he said in a voice that was almost cheerful. "We have fought over land and resources and religion and pride. And we have developed weapons that make your arsenal look like children's toys." He spread his calloused hands, showing the Emperor palms that had both planted seeds and ended lives. "We have bombs that can crack planets in half," he continued. "We have poisons that can kill in concentrations of parts per billion. And we have biological weapons that we keep locked away because even we are afraid of them." He leaned forward slightly, and his cheerful tone never wavered. "We have tactical doctrines that make your generals weep and strategic concepts that your admirals cannot comprehend," he said. "We developed all of this to use on each other, Your Majesty, because we were practicing." He let that word hang in the air for a moment. "Imagine what we will do to you if you give us a reason." The Mossad operative stepped forward and placed a small data chip on the floor before the throne. "This contains targeting information for every Goldorian military installation in this sector," she said in a quiet voice that was somehow more threatening than shouting. "We obtained it from your own networks by infiltrating your communication systems." She tilted her head slightly, and her dark eyes glittered with cold amusement. "It took us 3 weeks," she added. "Your encryption was not particularly difficult." The Emperor looked at his admirals, seeking reassurance, seeking confidence, seeking some sign that his forces could still achieve victory, but the admirals would not meet his eyes, and their silence spoke louder than any words. They had read the reports from Earth, and they knew what the Empire was facing. They had seen footage of grandmothers killing soldiers with kitchen knives and teachers leading assault teams through ruined cities. They had learned about the sleepers, the veterans, the millions of humans who carried war in their hearts like a sacred inheritance, and they knew that total victory on Earth would cost more lives than the Empire could afford to spend. "Withdraw," the Emperor commanded, and his voice was quiet with the weight of his first defeat. His admirals bowed and immediately began transmitting orders to the fleet. The Marine nodded once, as if the Emperor's surrender was exactly what he had expected, a wise decision. "Your Majesty," he said without a trace of mockery, "we did not want this war, but we were prepared to finish it if necessary." The 3 humans turned to leave, and Yelanara found herself calling out before she could stop herself. "Wait," she said, and the humans paused at the chamber door. "I need to understand how this is possible." She stepped forward, ignoring the warning looks from the guards and the Emperor's angry glare. "How can a species with no warrior caste fight like this?" she asked. "How can farmers and teachers and grandmothers become soldiers overnight?" The Marine turned back to face her, and for a moment his hard eyes softened with something that might have been sadness. "Ambassador, we do not have a warrior caste because we do not need one," he said. And his voice was heavy with old grief and older pride. "Every teacher in our schools would die before they let someone hurt their students," he continued. "Every parent on our world would kill without hesitation to protect their children. And every citizen who ever swore an oath to their country carries that oath in their heart forever." He shook his head slowly, as if he was remembering countless wars and countless dead. "You looked at Earth and saw civilians," he said. "You saw people going about their daily lives, working ordinary jobs, raising ordinary families." His voice hardened again, and his eyes became cold. "But you should have seen what we really are." "And what is that?" Yelanara asked, though part of her did not want to know the answer. The Marine smiled, and it was a warrior's smile, proud and fierce and ancient. "We are veterans who have not gone to war yet," he said. "Every single one of us waiting for someone to threaten what we love." He nodded once to the Emperor, a gesture of respect between enemies. And then the three humans walked out of the throne room. Without looking back, Yelanara watched them go. And she understood at last why the Empire had failed. They had not been defeated by Earth's technology, or Earth's military, or Earth's weapons. They had been defeated by something far more powerful. A species that refused to separate its warriors from its people, because every single member of that species carried the soul of a soldier. The Empire added Earth to their list of forbidden zones that very night. Territories too dangerous to conquer. And the official reports were classified at the highest possible level. But rumors spread through the galaxy faster than any official decree could contain them. Stories traveled from star system to star system. Tales of a small blue planet where grandmothers, killed with kitchen knives, and children led ambush through familiar forests. Other empires heard the stories and sent their own observers to study. The human species, they all returned with the same warning, written in reports that were shared between governments and military commands across 1,000 worlds. Let the humans sleep. Do not invade their world. Do not threaten their children. Do not give them a reason to remember what they are, because beneath their smiling faces and ordinary lives, beneath their peaceful cities and routine jobs, the humans are all warriors, and if you wake them up, they will show you exactly why their species has survived 10,000 years of constant warfare against itself. They are not civilians pretending to be soldiers. They are soldiers pretending to be civilians, and that makes them the most dangerous species in the galaxy.